There is a number that has been sitting quietly inside a government database for months. Most Canadians have absolutely no idea it exists, but that number tells you everything you need to know about where this country's rental market is actually headed. According to data published by the Ontario Landlord and Tenant Board and analysed by the housing advocacy platform RentZen as of January 2026, 80% of non-payment eviction cases in Ontario take somewhere between 2.7 and 15.7 months to reach a hearing. This means a landlord with a tenant who stopped paying rent in January of this year could still be waiting for a resolution sometime in the late fall. Meanwhile, the tenant gets to stay in the unit the entire time. Think about what that actually means for a moment. This is not a hypothetical scenario designed to shock you, but rather the operating reality of the Canadian residential rental system right now in the middle of 2026. It is systematically destroying small landlords and leaving tenants in a state of constant financial terror. This produces an outcome that is catastrophically bad for everyone regardless of which side of the lease you sit on. The story that gets told in the media is either about greedy landlords trying to illegally push out long-term renters, or it is about deadbeat tenants gaming the system and refusing to pay rent while the courts drag their feet. Both of those narratives are real, and both of them are also widely incomplete. What is actually happening in Canada's rental market right now is something far more structural and far more dangerous than either side of that argument is willing to admit. According to a report published by CBC News on May 7, 2026, drawing from data compiled by Rentals.ca and Urbanation, the average asking rent across Canada came in at $2,027 in April of 2026. This was down 4.7% year-over-year. It was down 5.2% specifically in Ontario, and down 5.9% in British Columbia. April marked the 19th consecutive month of year-over-year rent declines nationally, meaning rents have been falling for a year and a half straight. This sounds like great news until you understand that these rents are still sitting 21.9% above their pandemic-era levels. The market has cooled significantly from its peak, but it is still brutally unaffordable for a massive swath of the population. Urbanation President Sean Hildebrand put it plainly in that same CBC report, stating that rental prices in Canada had essentially returned to the levels we saw 3 years ago. This tells you that the speculative rocket ride of 2022 and 2023 has reversed but has not unwound, and 3 years ago was also not exactly a golden era of affordability for Canadian renters. So here is the trap that has been set. It was set not by any single villain but by a decade of compounding policy failures, and it has now snapped shut on hundreds of thousands of households simultaneously. Rents went up so fast and so far between 2020 and 2024 that a huge portion of the tenant population simply could not keep pace. Now rents are coming down from that stratospheric peak, but they are still far above what those same households can sustainably absorb. At the same time, the landlords who bought rental properties at the top of the market using 5% mortgage rates that have since repriced to 5.5% or 6% are now caught in a cash flow nightmare. The legal system that is supposed to mediate disputes between those two groups is so badly overwhelmed and underfunded that it is effectively non-functional for anyone who needs a decision within a reasonable timeframe. That is the three-sided trap. It has no clean exit, and understanding each side of it is the only way to understand why this market is frozen solid. Let us start with the landlords, because the math on their side of the ledger is genuinely brutal, and it is not being discussed honestly in most mainstream coverage. A report published in early 2026 by the Martin Group, which is a real estate advisory firm serving Halton Region landlords, outlined what they described as navigating the 2026 LTB backlog. The math they presented should alarm anyone who thinks small-scale rental investment is a passive income strategy. If you hold a $600,000 mortgage on a condo unit at a 5.5% interest rate, your monthly interest cost alone is approximately $2,750. That is before you add in the condo maintenance fees that in most Toronto buildings run between $500 and $900 per month. You also have to include the property tax that gets allocated to the unit, the landlord insurance premium, and any ongoing maintenance costs. So your total carrying cost on that unit is likely somewhere between $3,500 and $4,200 per month depending on the building. Your tenant is paying, let us say, $2,400 per month in rent, because you set the lease a couple of years ago and the guideline increases since then have not come close to covering your rising costs. You are already losing money on a cash flow basis, which many landlords were accepting as a bet on long-term appreciation, and then your tenant stops paying rent entirely. Now you file an L1 application with the Landlord and Tenant Board for non-payment of rent. According to RentZen's January 2026 analysis of LTB wait times, you are looking at a median hearing wait of roughly 3 months for non-payment cases in Ontario. The full range of cases stretches from just under 3 months to nearly 16 months depending on the backlog in your specific adjudication zone. A CBC Toronto report from early 2026 confirmed that average wait times even for the simpler non-payment cases still range from 3 to 7 months across the province. Let us use a conservative 6 months because 6 months is what a lot of landlords are actually experiencing. Over 6 months at $2,750 per month in interest alone, you have burned through $16,500 in financing costs while receiving zero rental income. If you add the full carrying cost of the unit at $3,800 per month, your total out-of-pocket loss over that 6-month wait is closer to $22,800. That is before you pay the paralegal or lawyer fees to actually navigate the LTB process, which can run another $3,000 to $5,000 for a contested hearing. Stretch that delay to 8 months and the cash bleed climbs to somewhere between $30,000 and $36,000. At 12 months, which falls within the documented range of outcomes according to the RentZen data, you are looking at losses approaching $50,000 on a single unit. That is not a landlord being greedy, but rather a landlord being actively financially destroyed by a broken administrative system. The Ontario Ombudsman's Office has not minced words about the state of the Landlord and Tenant Board. A report cited by CBC News described the LTB as fundamentally failing the people it is supposed to serve. That indictment covers both sides of the dispute, because tenants who have legitimate defenses against bad faith evictions are also trapped in the same dysfunctional queue. The whole system is generating a level of financial uncertainty that is poisoning the rental market from both ends. A recent legal update published by GTA Landlord as of 2026 notes that even with some improvements to the triage and scheduling process, the backlog of existing cases continues to suppress the board's ability to deliver timely decisions. This means the reforms have been too slow and too incremental to actually solve the problem on any timeline that matters to the people currently trapped inside it. Now here is where the story gets even darker. Ontario's Bill 60 came into force in 2026 and was analysed in detail by both the Metis Nation of Ontario fact sheet and the legal firm GLLLP in their July 2026 landlord update. This represents an attempt by the province to tighten the screws on tenants who fall behind on rent, and the changes are significant. Under the new rules that took effect in mid-2026, tenants who are behind on rent now have just 7 days to repay their arrears after an N-for notice is issued. This is down from the previous 14-day window. The review deadline for challenging decisions has also been cut from 30 days to 15. GLLLP's analysis noted that these changes give landlords a faster path to termination on paper, but the bottleneck is not the legal notice period. The real bottleneck is the adjudication queue at the LTB. Shortening the window for tenants to respond to notices does not do anything about the 3 to 7 month wait for an actual hearing. The net effect of Bill 60 is to create a faster-moving legal threat for tenants, while doing essentially nothing to accelerate relief for landlords who are already in financial distress. Let us talk about the tenants. The narrative of the strategic non-payer who deliberately refuses to pay rent knowing they are protected by LTB delays is real, but it represents a small fraction of the total population of people who are currently behind on their rent. The much larger population is simply people who have run out of money. A 2026 report summarized on Yahoo Finance and Newswire noted that national rental vacancy had risen to 3.1% and that landlords were increasingly offering incentives to attract tenants in a market where demand had cooled. This sounds paradoxical given the arrears crisis, but it makes complete sense when you understand that the tenant population has effectively bifurcated. You have a group of people who are housed and just barely hanging on, and you have a growing group of people who simply cannot afford to be a tenant at all under current market conditions. Those people are not flowing into vacant apartments, but rather they are doubling up or moving back in with parents. They are creating exactly the kind of invisible housing stress that does not show up in the vacancy statistics, but is absolutely visible in the financial data and in the conversations happening on Canadian social media and housing forums. A YouTube documentary from a Canadian housing advocacy channel tackled the dimension of this crisis that involves Quebec renters. It noted that 1 in 5 Quebec renters struggle to pay rent in 2025. While that specific figure is drawn from Quebec data and covers 2025, it is directionally consistent with what housing researchers across the country are reporting for the broader Canadian rental population entering 2026. The affordability math is similar across most major urban centres regardless of province. The Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario, known as ACTO, published a 2026 analysis stating that Ontario's budget falls short as more Ontarians face growing affordability pressures. That framing captures the dynamic precisely, because the relief being offered by government is incremental, while the financial stress being experienced by low to moderate income renters is acute and compounding. The overcrowding response to this stress is not being captured well in official statistics, but it is visible in behavioral data and in the nature of the rental listings that are performing well versus sitting empty. A Facebook post circulating in Toronto housing groups and shared widely in spring 2026 noted that renting in Toronto is now over $2,100 per month cheaper than owning. This gap is historically enormous and reflects the fact that even at $2,027 nationally for an average asking rent, the carrying cost of ownership at current mortgage rates is dramatically higher. But that same $2,027 national average is still well above what a single person earning a median wage can comfortably absorb when the standard rule of thumb says housing should consume no more than 30% of gross income. The math that the advocacy groups keep coming back to is simple and devastating. A person earning the Ontario median wage of roughly $53,000 per year has a gross monthly income of about $4,417, and 30% of that is $1,325. The average asking rent in Toronto or Vancouver for even a one-bedroom unit is still well above $2,000. This means that housing affordability for a median-earning single-person household in Canada's 2 largest cities is not a marginal problem. It is a structural impossibility without either a second income or a subsidy, and there are a lot of people in this country who have neither. If you think the affordability gap is the worst part of this story, wait until you understand what happens when a tenant who genuinely cannot pay rent also cannot afford to move. Moving in the Canadian rental market requires first and last month's rent upfront. At Toronto pricing, this means you need $4,000 to $5,000 in cash ready to go before you can even sign a new lease. Most people who are behind on rent are behind specifically because they do not have $4,000 to $5,000 in liquid savings, so they are trapped in place. This means the eviction process, long and painful as it is often the only mechanism that actually moves people out of units they can no longer afford. The landlord is left holding the financial loss for the entire duration of that process. The cooling of asking rents that the Rentals.ca and Urbanation data confirmed for April 2026 is in part a product of Canada's federal decision to significantly cap international student admissions and temporary resident entries beginning in 2024 and 2025. A report published by Visa HQ in April 2026 analyzed how the migration cap changes had begun to cool the rent spiral in major urban centers. It also warned that experts were concerned about long-term risks to the supply pipeline. The same investors who were building rental apartments are now pulling back due to exactly the cash flow and LTB delay issues we have been discussing. So the near-term cooling in rents is real, and it is providing some relief to a segment of the market, but it is setting up a supply crunch in the medium term. This could reproduce the exact affordability crisis of 2022 and 2023 in a new form once population growth reasserts itself. The Yahoo Finance Rental Market Stabilization Report for 2026 flagged this explicitly. It noted that while the immediate picture shows landlords offering incentives in a softer demand environment, the slowdown in high-rise construction means the longer-term supply problem could reassert itself with force. That is the structural time bomb sitting underneath what looks on the surface like a market that is finally calming down. The BC picture deserves its own paragraph because while Ontario has received the bulk of media attention for its LTB dysfunction, British Columbia's residential tenancy branch has its own troubled history with hearing delays. The provincial government released information in 2025 claiming that wait times had been reduced substantially through new administrative measures. However, housing advocates in the province have questioned whether those improvements are holding as caseloads continue to rise. The CBC British Columbia coverage of tenancy disputes consistently shows a population of renters and landlords who feel the system is not responsive to their actual situations. The national rent data from Rentals.ca shows BC rents falling 5.9% year-over-year as of April 2026. This is actually the steepest provincial decline in the country, and it reflects a Vancouver market where asking rents have been pushed down by a combination of softer demand and growing listings inventory. But the average Vancouver one-bedroom is still priced in a range that leaves most renters spending an unsustainable share of their income on housing. Now let us look at where this goes from here. This is the part of the story that most people in the media are not willing to engage with honestly, and it is the most important part if you are trying to make financial decisions in this environment. In the best-case scenario, the Ontario government's LTB reforms under Bill 60 combined with ongoing investments in adjudication resources actually start to move the needle on hearing wait times in a meaningful way. They get the average non-payment case down to something closer to 6 to 8 weeks instead of 3 to 7 months. Simultaneously, the federal and provincial governments agree on a significant rental assistance program that helps the most financially stressed tenants cover arrears without requiring eviction. Supply-side incentives for purpose-built rental construction are expanded enough to bring meaningful new inventory online by 2027 and 2028, which stabilizes the market and begins to close the affordability gap. You should know that almost none of the housing economists and analysts whose work tracks this market believe all three of those things will happen simultaneously. The political will required to fund tenant assistance at the scale needed has not been demonstrated by any level of Canadian government in recent memory. The best-case scenario is real, but it requires a level of coordinated policy ambition that Canada has not shown in housing for at least a decade. The realistic case scenario is what the weight of the current data actually points to over the next 2 to 3 years. The LTB wait times improve marginally but never get close to the 6 to 8 week standard that most housing legal experts say is needed to restore market function. Landlord cash flow losses continue to push small-scale investors out of the market, which removes supply from the rental pool because those condo units get sold to owner-occupants or simply sit vacant while being listed for sale. The national vacancy rate that rose to 3.1% in early 2026 begins to tighten again as population growth through immigration resumes its upward trend following the temporary cap period. In that environment, rents stabilize at their current levels through the remainder of 2026 and into 2027. They then begin climbing again as vacancy falls below 2% in the major urban markets. The next wave of rent increases hits a population of tenants that never fully recovered financially from the last one, producing a second and potentially worse wave of arrears stress in 2028 and beyond. This is not a catastrophic outcome in the short term, but it is a grinding one, and it means the crisis does not resolve, it simply pauses and reloads. The worst-case scenario requires two things happening that are not inevitable but are also not implausible. The first is that mortgage renewals across the landlord population hit harder than anticipated in 2026 and 2027. 5-year fixed-rate mortgages taken out at the height of the 2021 and 2022 frenzy come up for renewal at rates that are still meaningfully higher than their origination rates. The second is that the LTB backlog gets significantly worse rather than better. Bill 60 generates a flood of new filings because landlords who previously absorbed the wait time are now rushing to use the new faster notice procedures. If both of those things happen together, you get a wave of landlord mortgage defaults that causes a disorderly exit from the small investor condo market. Units are sold under financial stress and potentially at discounted prices, which creates a feedback loop where falling condo prices eliminate the remaining equity cushion for other leveraged landlords. The brutal realistic advice is to contact a tenant legal clinic as early as possible and understand your actual timeline. Use whatever window you have to either negotiate a repayment agreement with your landlord or make a clean exit to a situation you can actually afford, because being evicted with a large arrears judgment on your record is a much worse outcome than making a hard financial decision early. If you are a homeowner in Ontario facing a mortgage renewal in the next 12 to 18 months, the LTB crisis matters to you even if you do not own a rental property. The wave of distressed condo sales that could come out of landlord financial stress is the single biggest downside risk to Toronto and Hamilton condo values over the next 2 to 3 years. If you own in a building with a lot of investor-owned units, you should be thinking carefully about what a 10 to 15% correction in condo values would do to your equity position and your refinancing options at renewal time. If you are an investor currently looking at Ontario rental real estate as a potential purchase, the math on new acquisitions at current prices and current interest rates is not working for most product types. The LTB delay risk means that even a well-underwritten purchase can turn into a cash flow disaster if you encounter a non-paying tenant and have no financial cushion to absorb a 6 to 12-month wait for resolution. The GTA Landlord blog's 2026 analysis of LTB wait times makes clear that this risk is not hypothetical and is not confined to bad neighborhoods or below-market buildings. It can happen anywhere in the province, and any investment analysis that does not price in a 6 to 12-month zero-income scenario as a real possibility is not an honest analysis of the current market. If you are a small landlord already holding a property with a non-paying tenant and you are in the early stages of the LTB process, the honest advice from the legal commentary available right now is to get professional representation as early as possible. Unrepresented applications have a much lower success rate and much longer timelines than represented ones. The cost of paralegal representation is almost always less than the additional months of carrying cost you would absorb by navigating the process alone. The Visture.ca analysis of Bill 60's changes for Ontario landlords noted that the new rules do give landlords faster tools at the notice stage, but the adjudication stage is still where cases get bogged down. Knowing how to file correctly and follow up aggressively within the system is the difference between a 7-month wait and a 4-month wait, and that difference is worth thousands of dollars. All the sources for the facts and figures you have seen today are provided in the description below for your own verification. I read every comment on this channel and I would appreciate it if you shared how this situation is impacting your local area or your family budget. If you find this kind of unfiltered economic reporting valuable, please hit the subscribe button and I will see you in the next one.